Madam Director General, what a pleasure to see you.
Thank you, Wei. Welcome. It's good to see you too.
Let's talk about the most important issue, globalization. At the opening lecture of the WTO Public Forum, we discussed that. But now you can see everywhere here at the forum signs of re-globalization, which is the WTO's contribution about the latest stage of globalization. Tell us more about exactly what you mean.
Well, thank you so much for that question. There has been a lot of discussion of experts, commentators, opinion makers talking about deglobalization, the death of globalization. And what we wanted to do at the WTO is to point out that first, we don't believe that globalization is dead or that the world is really deglobalizing. Globalization has slowed down. That is true from the peak in the 1990s and 2000s. However, there are many developing countries, many poor countries who have not yet benefited from globalization. And globalization helped to lift more than 1 billion people, 1.5 billion, out of poverty. And it's not only about China. Even if you remove China, it helped other developing countries. The poor countries who have not yet benefited don't want to see this go away, but they want the globalization to be implemented in a different fashion. And we were trying to think at the WTO, what is the nature? How do we reimagine globalization to benefit those who were left at the margin? And former chief economists came up with this term, re-globalization. Let us reimagine so that, for example, when we are trying to talk about building resilience of supply chains, you remember that during the pandemic, supply chains were seen as vulnerable, as too concentrated in certain countries. The world needs to build resilience by deconcentrating. Well, this is an opportunity for re-globalization. Let's deconcentrate those supply chains and locate them in those countries that didn't benefit so that they can create manufacturing and services and other types of jobs, and so that these countries can also lift up their living standards for their people. So that is what we're saying. Now, when we are talking about that, it's about private sector relocating supply chains. So those countries have to do a lot of work to make sure their macroeconomic environment, their business environment is good. Business is not about charity. But we are convinced from our data at the WTO that there are enough other countries that are not so rich, but who have good environment for business. So let's locate supply chains in those countries and re-globalize.
Do you think it has worked so far in that way? We have heard different voices. Some countries might be successful, countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and just another few. But others, for example, those on the African continent, are saying, is this really coming to us? Or it's only a fairy tale that's written in others' rhetorics?
Well, that is a fair comment. And that is what we're pointing out, that re-globalization and deconcentration of supply chains doesn't only have to be a China plus one story. It's not just about China plus Vietnam or China plus Indonesia or India. It can also involve Bangladesh, for instance, that has, I think, the right environment. Cambodia already is receiving some supply chains. You can think in East Asia of several countries that could benefit. And Africa, you come to Africa, there are countries in Africa that have the right environment. And some of them, you might be surprised, like Rwanda. Rwanda is a country with a very good business environment that has a very good infrastructure, including telecommunications. Why not locate relocate pharmaceutical manufacturing there? South Africa, even my country, Nigeria, is a large population, a large market. Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire. So there are countries that could benefit. You can see I'm quite excited.
I can tell you're very excited when it comes to how to bring others who have not yet benefited.
And can I make one more point on that? In addition to relocating supply chains, re-globalization also involves developing certain value chains in place. For example, critical minerals. Everyone is looking now for critical minerals because of the need for clean energy, EV batteries, and so on. And many countries in Africa and in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, these countries, they all have these critical minerals. But the idea is not to repeat the mistakes of the past, of just coming, extracting those minerals and taking them to process. Even processing in China, we are saying to China, develop the value chain in place, process the minerals there, even go all the way to manufacturing the batteries. It doesn't have to be in one country. There can be a regional value chain that you can develop within Africa, for instance, or Central Asia. That is also re-globalization.
These are wonderful ideas, and I see a lot of things are already happening with the investment, for example, coming from China. Earlier, also, Madam Director General, since you mentioned about Africa and China, FOCAC, the Forum of Cooperation between China and Africa, was just held in Beijing. Almost all African countries and economies are represented there. So how 10 areas of cooperation have been strategically set between China and African countries, $50 billion of input for the current stage. So how do you see these kinds of bilateral, quote-unquote, interactions among economies who are many your members?
Well, almost all the countries who are there are members of the WTO.
Yes.
So we see the FOCAC and the outcome as part of the opportunity to actually put into practice this re-globalization. A lot of the 50 billion that is being talked about will also go for green infrastructure and green energy, which I think is very important. So this is the opportunity. China can use these resources to support these countries to develop the critical minerals, the green hydrogen, the green infrastructure that we are talking about. So we are looking forward to that. We hope that some of those resources will be deployed in the way and manner we are talking about, so that China develops value chains, and any other investor or country that wants to participate in this. The Europeans, EU, they have a program to do just that,
right,
and support the development of value chains. The US is also coming. All are welcome. Africa, as I always say, has many suitors.
Having said that, though, WTO is facing both challenges and opportunity, as you always argue. This is 30 years anniversary of WTO, yet we see than ever before the rise of protectionism and fragmentation. So how do you, sitting where you are here in Geneva, looking at those trends, and how would you deal with the challenges as a result?
Well, this is why we want to speak to our members and say, look, the trading system, the multilateral trading system with the rules-based system that has been created, anchored by the WTO, has served well. Not just for 30 years. Yes, the WTO is 30 years, but remember, the precursor to the WTO was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is 80 years old. Right. It has served the world. It has led to really peaceful development and interdependence. And so we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should not start to look at measures that divide. We should sit back and think, if the system does not serve us for 21st century issues, how can we reform it and reimagine it to serve? It's not to say, let's now do what we want to do for ourselves, because ultimately trade is about interdependence. So this is what we're saying. We're trying to point out the downside risks in pursuing these measures and the upside potential of actually trying to reform the system to deliver what we want. We have so many challenges. We have challenges of global health. No one country can solve it alone. You need the world to cooperate, and you need the trading system. Without the trading system, managing the pandemic would have been so much harder. You couldn't have gotten the supplies from one place to the other, be it medical equipment or vaccines. You have a climate change and sustainability issues to deal with. No one country, no one member of WTO can solve on its own. We need to work together. We have problems of inequality, inclusion, You can't solve it alone. These are global issues that we need global cooperation. We need a multilateral system. Therefore, we are pointing out, okay? We are pointing out and we are doing analysis to buttress our points that it pays to remain together, not to break apart.
Certain economy, also members of the WTO, since WTO almost have all the economies in the world as members, try to use domestic legislation to ban products coming from some specific countries. And as a result, totally destroy, as members of WTO, their responsibilities to garner the rules-based trade system. How do you see this unilateral approach?
Well, first of all, let me ask us to step back. I know that these unilateral measures have been happening from several members and several countries. But let's say this. I want to make 2 points. First, let us remember that in spite of these measures, they affect only a small portion of trade so far. Okay, that's why we want it not to go too far. 75% of world trade is still taking place under WTO terms. Okay, so remember that in spite of all the things you're seeing, the bulk of world trade is still taking part. Now, even between the US and China, let's look. It's several sectors that are being impacted. I know it sounds like a lot, but I don't want us to maybe see it as out of proportion. Let's remember that the bulk of world trade, even between the US and China, is still taking place, and it's taking place on WTO terms. Yes, certain sectors are impacted, but we are also saying let's try to limit the impact of these measures. So that's the way we are going. We can only talk to our members, plead with our members. So far, the value and the extent of these measures is not yet as large. The world trading system is still functioning fairly well, but I want to make it clear we don't want to see more and more of these measures. Number one, because it's going to impact developing countries, the poorer countries, even more and more if this continues, and they will lose out.
And also as a result of unilateral approaches, when it piled up, it would eventually influence the fate of the multilateral trading system.
I've always said unilateral approaches will lead to lose-lose. We've seen this movie before. Okay, in the early 1930s we had that. So let's try not to do that. And developing, the poor countries who are members of the WTO will not have the power to compete or to defend themselves against measures. So we're really worried that they would be the losers in this if we continue in this way. So beyond that, we are just talking to a member, and of course we have mechanisms within the WTO. It's a member-driven organization. It's not really up to the Secretariat even to say too much or to take action. But for members, when they feel that they're being impacted by the policies of other members, we have various mechanisms that they can use to bring this to their attention. We have consultations, and these are taking place, believe it or not.
Yes, about that, the consultation process on the issue of electronic vehicles, for example, bilateral taking place among some of the members of WTO. We saw, for example, the government of China have filed for consultations within the WTO system. First of all, toward the United States. Now we see that consultation has not yet worked. Now there's also seek for consultation with Canada as well. Also, at the same time, this week, China expressed the desire to continue the discussion with the EU on electronic vehicles and other disputes. So this is positive that members of the WTO is taking advantage of the WTO rules, which everybody signed up. But on the other hand, we are also seeing, the mechanism of WTO. For example, the eventual tool that you have, appellate body, has been somewhat paralyzed. So eventually, even with all this consultation doesn't work, the members should go to the appellate body, but they can't right now.
Well, let me just say a few things on that. First of all, Yes, China called for consultations. It hasn't happened. They have another chance to call for consultations. And I think the consultations will begin to happen. If it's not successful, then there are other measures. But what is good about the WTO is that it has a series of steps you can follow. And we are finding increasingly that in between those steps, members are able to start exchanging with each other. We also think that there was perhaps a great deal of use of the appellate body in the past. Now that it's not there, members are trying to use other mechanisms which were seen they were foreseen in the dispute settlement system. More dialogue, more arbitration, more use of third parties to settle disputes. This does not mean that we do not reform the appellate body. We are working on the reform of the appellate body. And it's going on, and we hope we have a mandate from ministers to reform it, to reform the entire dispute settlement system, including the second tier. So let's see how that goes on. But in the meantime, the dispute settlement system is being used quite actively. Now, I want to tell you, you remember China, Australia? China and Australia have been able to use means other than going through the entire dispute settlement system to settle the disputes they had on wine, on barley, on various other products that were stopped in terms of trade between the two members. And we're quite proud of the result of what the two members have been able to do. We want to see more of that. And we hope that some of these other disputes coming up will follow the same pattern. But nevertheless, we still think that we need to reform the system, the dispute settlement system, including the appellate body, and we're working on it.
You have been working ardently since the MC13. You have also been encouraging all the members to walk the talk, quote unquote. It's a direct quote from you, by the way. So how do you see the three issues that were important outcome of MC13? Fishery, investment, and the list goes on.
Why would you want to join if you don't think you'll get benefits? And we have 22 more countries who are trying to join. Uzbekistan, Bosnia, and Ethiopia. I could go on, and we're very happy to work with them. So there were some really good benefits that we got, but there were some that we did not get, some disappointments. We didn't close on fisheries 2, the second phase of fisheries, on investment facilitation for development, which is a plurilateral agreement with 125 members who wanted annexed and multilateralized within the WTO system. We didn't get that. Dispute settlement reform, we got a mandate to continue the work, so that was good. E-commerce moratorium, we got that extended. But for these two, fisheries and IFD, investment facilitation, we decided to continue work in Geneva. And we are working on it, and we are hoping and expecting that by the end of the year, we'll begin to see some good results from these two agreements.
Make sure everybody is still very united in a way for work.
Well, it's a consensus-building organization, and so we cannot make any decisions unless by consensus. On the one hand, that makes it quite tough. On the other hand, I'm proud of it because this is the one organization where the smallest member has the same voice as the largest member. So even though it's difficult, we do it. So how does it work? We have to work really hard, getting members together to talk to each other, to see each other's point of view. That's why it takes time at the WTO to get through things. But does that mean we give up? Absolutely not. We have to continue working on these things, interacting with the ambassadors, trying to get them into negotiating sessions, into informal sessions to work out their issues and their problems.
How do you see China's role now at the WTO? How does WTO work with countries and economies like China? And meanwhile, how do you see the future of WTO at this critical juncture?
Well, let me start with the latter. I think that the WTO's future is quite bright. And I know it sounds strange at a time when there are many challenges about the difficult atmosphere for trade. I know that sounds, but do you know why I say that? There are very many interesting developments in trade. We have digital trade, especially digitally delivered services trade. All those services entertainment, services traded over the internet, computer services, education. It's booming. We have women, small and medium enterprises trading over the internet, booming. We need to make rules to provide guidance and guidelines and a level playing field for that kind of trade. So we have work to do. Green trade. The world needs to go green. And trade can be part of that answer because we need to get to net zero by 2050. The world has decided. We have a part in doing that. Inclusiveness. We just talked about the fact that there were poor countries who didn't benefit, poor regions in rich countries who didn't benefit from globalization. Trade can be part of re-including them through re-globalization. There's a whole interesting agenda. So the WTO's future is, I see it as bright. We just did a 5-year strategy for the Secretariat for the first time ever till 2030. Now, coming back to the role of China, China is a strong supporter of the multilateral trading system within the WTO and has continued to assure us of its support. Now, does that mean that everything and the relationship with China and everything is 100%? Well, we just did a trade policy review for China. And in the trade policy review, we pointed out that China is the second largest economy in the world. China matters. And that there are certain things that China could do better. More transparency with its information and its numbers, particularly subsidies. We asked, actually, about a year ago, I met Premier Li Qiang and I made the same request. And actually, after that request, Premier Li Qiang promised that we would get data, and we did. Even from the provinces, we got a lot of data for the first time. We would like that to continue. Within the trade policy review, we found some other data on subsidies that we had not found before. And we had a very strong argument with China about including this. It was not easy. But I'm proud that at the end of the day, the Chinese government said we could include it in the report. That is part of transparency. We want China to do more of that. You know, I think that's the right thing for a big economy with that power to be more transparent with its information. And we're really looking forward to continuing that type of interaction. Also, during the trade policy review, for the first time, China brought a strong delegation that held a seminar here for the first time ever, trying to explain China's policies, to try to increase transparency. And I think that is a good thing. We need China to continue to do more and more of that so that the questions being asked by the rest of the membership can be answered.